Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Francophile Reader. So today we are continuing our read-along of Notre-Dame de Paris, or The Hunchback of Notre Dame, by Victor Hugo. So, if you're subscribed to my channel, and you usually watch my read-along live streams, I hope that you received my community post last week saying that I was canceling the live stream because I was traveling back to the United States. Today I am trying something new with Premiere videos because the Wi-Fi in my family's house is pretty poor, so live streaming would probably not work very well. And I'm hoping that this will be a better viewing experience for you all since I will have taped this in advance. But the live chat feature should be available and I will be there responding to your comments. So hopefully this is a better experience for you as it will be a better experience for me. So today I actually want to talk more about the Cathedral because book 3 is all about the Cathedral of Notre-Dame as well as of Paris. It is a very history-centered, architecture-centered book, and I know that parts of it, maybe all of it, was very boring for you, so I wanted to give you some historical background. But first, let's talk a little bit more about Pierre Gringoire, because at the end of book 2, we see that Pierre Gringoire is infatuated by the bohemian, we'll call her a bohemian, Esmeralda, and he's stalking her. And what I find so interesting is how Gringoire sees himself. He views himself as this great artist, as this great poet, and nobody else around him seems to share these views. So, for example, when he puts on his morality play, at first people want to watch something, so they're ready for entertainment. But then when it becomes clear that his play is a morality play with allegorical figures, nobody at the Palais de Justice is actually interested, and they're just completely distracted by the cardinal and his contingency and just all the people who are watching, and they're more interested in the Feast of Fools that's proposed rather than whatever play Gringoire is producing. And yet Gringoire still thinks of himself very highly. We do see, though, that he is very poor. Even if he is cultured, he, in some ways, is not much different from the peasants whom he encounters, and yet he still sees himself as totally different from them. So he is stalking Esmeralda, and then he sees these two men who attempt to kidnap her, and then she runs off, and Quasimodo was one of the two people who was trying to snatch her. Esmeralda seems to teach Gringoire a lesson when Gringoire finally ends up in the Cour des Miracles, the Court of Miracles, and there are all of these thieves and all of these criminals who are practicing. You know, they're basically practicing putting on a play, so to speak, playing a role. They're practicing pretending to have various disabilities, or, you know, maybe being a friar or whatever, to try to convince people to give them money. There's this the lead bandit basically tells Gringoire that he has to pickpocket this mannequin without ringing any of the bells that are hanging off of this mannequin, otherwise he will be hanged. Of course, Gringoire is unable to do that because he doesn't know this trade at all. And then somehow they decide that, well, they'll give him another chance. One of the women who are there will have to decide to marry him. And of course, none of the women want to marry him, except Esmeralda, who steps forward and agrees to marry him. And at first, Gringoire is just very relieved because someone has saved his life. But of course, because he has a huge ego, he expects that Esmeralda would actually marry him. And really, she just wanted to save his life. She had no interest in marrying him at all. So we just see how Gringoire's ego constantly gets in the way. I love the part where Gringoire starts blaming Quasimodo and saying, well, Quasimodo was trying to kidnap you, Esmeralda, and was following you and everything. And Esmeralda's like, well, weren't you doing the same thing? And Gringoire feels like, no, it was very different. Like, he is so different from Quasimodo that it was okay for him to stalk Esmeralda, whereas it wasn't okay for all these other people. There's also the scene that there's several scenes in Notre-Dame de Paris that actually get me thinking of medieval and early modern texts. For example, some of the historical figures that are mentioned seem to have come from the testament of François Villon. François Villon was a 15th century poet and a criminal. He was a thief. He's said to have murdered someone. And I think that it's a clever idea for Hugo to take some of his really outrageous, eccentric characters from Villon's semi-autobiography, or his fictional autobiography, perhaps, The Testament. That's definitely worth reading if you want to get some understanding of who the Coquillards are. For example, the Coquillards were a group of pilgrims who were going on the way of St. James, and they had a reputation for being for bawdy humor, for being thieves, etc. So anyway, I saw references to Villon's Testament. I also saw some references to Pantagruel, which is by Rabelais. Rabelais was a 16th century satirist, and at one point we have, so Pantagruel and Gargantua, those are two books that Rabelais wrote. They're about two giants, and these two books are satires on the church, on evangelical humanism, on a number of really current events in the early 16th century. And at one point, Pantagruel, who is our giant, encounters this other giant named Panurge, he's evidently been roasted alive by some Turks. And he's completely charred, and he somehow escaped. But he doesn't know the French language. And so Panurge starts just speaking in all of the different languages that he knows. And Pantagruel and all of his friends, clearly aware that this guy is suffering, and probably just want something to drink and a place to stay, are just making fun of him and all the languages he's speaking. And you see a sort of something similar in, I think it's at the end of book 2 of Notre-Dame de Paris, where Gringoire is being pursued by all of these beggars who are speaking a variety of different languages. It seems Spanish, Italian, and Latin in particular. And he's like, oh, what language they're speaking? I don't understand what they're saying. Oh, they're speaking the devil's language. It's very clear what it is that they're asking for. They're asking for bread. They're asking for, place to stay, probably. But this is also a running humor in some other early modern texts, like the farce of Master Patelin. I mentioned the play a little bit last week. So Victor Hugo is very well versed in pre and early modern French literature, and I think that if you've read some of that, you can appreciate those elements, but it's not absolutely necessary. I mean, my edition has huge footnotes. I mean, just look at how long the footnotes are. You tell, like, this is the text, and there's the footnotes, okay? So, I don't read all of them. I don't think it's necessary to read all of them, but there are nods to these texts, which I really like. So, that is what I wanted to talk about with respect to Pierre Gringoire. Now I want to talk about the Cathedral of Notre-Dame, which is the subject of, I believe, book 3. This section is probably the section that people least like in this book, because they don't really understand what purpose it serves. And we can say, okay, Victor Hugo is probably paid by the word, and that's why he has these sections. But I also think about a text like Moby Dick, where the Cetology chapters, in my opinion, those are the chapters about whales and whaling, are the most important chapters, because they're not just about whales. They're about the human condition. They're about Ahab. They're about Ishmael. And so I think it's important to pay attention to this book, even if it is really boring. And I understand that it is. Even for myself, it is hard to get through. Victor Hugo wrote Notre-Dame de Paris in part to promote the restoration of the cathedral. there was a major restoration that occurred in the 19th century, and in fact, the gargoyles and the grotesques that Notre-Dame is most famous for today were created in the 19th century. I made a video talking about the destruction, the fire, and kind of my views about how Notre-Dame should be restored. In that video, I talk a little bit about the history of the restoration of the cathedral and how it had been restored at various times in different art styles for the past 900 years. So this cathedral is a blending of different art styles, different periods, different histories. This is not one cathedral that has remained the same for 800 years. And Victor Hugo talks about that. He talks about how when you look at different parts of the cathedral, you can learn about different parts of history. Hugo wrote a pamphlet. So this is the pamphlet he wrote, Guerre aux démolisseurs, War on the Demolishers. And I'm going to be reading you passages in English, this English translation by Danny Smith. I will link the PDF below. So, Victor Hugo was writing Notre-Dame de Paris in part in response to the destruction of monuments by the revolutionaries during what is known as the July Revolution of 1830. The July Revolution dethroned Charles X, who was the last Bourbon monarch, and I think there was, like, his nephew was dethroned or sent in exile, I'm not sure, in 1848. So the Bourbon monarchy essentially comes to an end in 1830. And one of the ways that revolutionaries signaled the end of the Bourbon monarchy and the ancien regime, the old regime, was through the destruction of monuments. If this sounds modern, it is, because revolutions often go, iconoclasm, the destruction of icons, the destruction of monuments in general, often goes alongside revolutions. It also goes alongside totalitarian regimes, because totalitarian regimes, for example, like the Islamic Revolution in Iran, led to the destruction of a lot of Zoroastrian art. But Victor Hugo was very opposed to the destruction of these monuments. And so this is a very fiery pamphlet, and it shouldn't take you very long to read. At the very least, I recommend you read the page-and-a-half introduction by Danny Smith, where he talks about the background and kind of some of the things to think about when considering monuments and just art in general. Victor Hugo does not consider the imperialist aspect of these monuments. He doesn't mention that in this pamphlet at all. It is not at all a concern. Whereas today, as we talk about statues, and the value of having the statue, for example, of a slave owner, that is certainly the case. And I think that that's probably one of the weakest points, I think, in this pamphlet, but I want to go into what Victor Hugo says. So here's what he says. Every day, many old memories of France are lost with the stone on which they were written. Every day we destroy some page of the venerable book of tradition. And soon, when the ruin of all these ruins has been achieved, there will remain nothing more for us to do than to cry with that Trojan, though at the least he rescued his gods, fuit Ilium et ingens gloria. Troy is no more, nor her great glory. And then there is this longer passage, which I will actually put in full on the screen, and I will put the English as I read it in English, because this is actually responding to the July Revolution. I know that this topic is very modern, and I think that it's worth discussing and talking about what the value of monuments are. Notre-Dame de Cathedral, when it was on fire, there was a lot of discussion, on Twitter, of course, about whether or not this cathedral should even be restored, or whether it should be destroyed completely. Because the fact of the matter is, while on the one hand this cathedral is ridiculously beautiful, and it's a cathedral, so it is a house of worship with relics, it's also very bound up with the history of French imperialism and a lot of other barbaric things that the French did. You know, when it comes to talking about revolution, like, The French know revolution, so I think this is interesting. Since the July Revolution, such profanations have continued, yet more gruesomely and fatally and in other guises. A pretext of piety has been succeeded by national, liberal, patriotic, philosophical, and Voltairian pretexts. One no longer restores, one no longer even spoils, one no longer even makes ugly. One simply tears down. And one has good reason for this. A church is fanaticism. A dungeon is feudalism. One denounces a monument. One massacres a pile of stones. One Septemberizes the ruins. Our poor churches can now but attempt to save themselves by taking up absurd disguises. Not a single Notre-Dame in France. No master how colossal, how venerable, how magnificent, how impartial, how historical, how magisterial, does not today have a little tricolor flag dangling from her ear. Often one can save an admirable church by writing above its entrance, Town Hall. Nothing is less popular among us than these edifices made by the people and for the people. They are wanted for all the crimes of times past to which they were witness. We wish to erase it all fully from our history. We devastate, we pulverize, we destroy, we demolish in the national spirit. In the interest of being good Frenchmen, we have become excellent Welches. So Victor Hugo rails against the destruction of monuments, just as much as he rails against the creation of new monuments in the more modern art styles. So he goes off on the Louvre, saying that the Louvre is ugly. But, you know, for example, the Louvre is made up of a lot of art pieces that were stolen from other countries. Art is both a preservation of history, but also it can create a false sense of history. So, for example, the Nazis, they stole art from all over the world because that was a way of promoting the Nazi mythos that was behind the Holocaust. This is also the reason, by the way, why the Grimm brothers in the 19th century collected fairy tales. Their reason was also to promote German nationalism. So I think it is, you know, the one weakness I see in Victor Hugo's argument is this lack of concern for the imperialism, the theft, the violence that is behind these monuments. In the aftermath of the 1830 July Revolution, there were some revolutionaries who believed that the destruction of these monuments was wrong. And what they proposed was to put these pieces in museums. So they would actually hide the art rather than destroy them, and then ultimately put them in museums. So museums can be very helpful and very useful. I think about museums that exist, say, for the Holocaust, where, you know, we have all of these horrible things in this museum, but it's to educate about the past. That is what I think would probably be the best way to approach, say, a statue of a slave master, a slave trader, who trafficked 100,000 Africans, 20,000 of whom died along the way. If you have a statue of him in a public square, I don't think you can convince me that it serves any other purpose than to promote slavery. Of course, there was an artist who produced the statue, and of course it has some significance. I mean, the fact that people are fighting to keep it up. But it probably belongs in a museum. But not just in a museum to show, oh, look at this beautiful statue, but as a way of educating about the history of slavery in the United States. I say all of this because, again, this is a very modern topic, and it was a topic that was very modern for Victor Hugo. He was very involved in thinking about what we do about older buildings and what they signify. He is, of course, also dealing with a church, and so there's always questions of iconoclasm. But he was right, you know, he was right that revolutionaries tied the church to tyranny. Hugo himself, I believe, was an atheist, or at least at the end of his life, he was an atheist. So he wasn't a particularly religious person. He really wanted to keep this cathedral because of its historical significance and because it's part of the French patrimony. And today, when Notre-Dame the Cathedral is being restored, it's being restored not because of its religious significance, because France is laïque, it is very, very secular, but because it is a historic monument. I actually visited Notre-Dame Cathedral. I didn't go inside it because it was, well, it's been destroyed, so it's now closed to the public, but I visited the cathedral, And I took some pictures. So this is more of the self-indulgent part where I show you the images that I took of the cathedral. This was like 2 weeks before lockdown, so like, or no, maybe not 2 weeks before lockdown, but 2 weeks before the coronavirus stuff became known in Switzerland, where I was living. And so I was visiting Paris, and I visited the Louvre, and I visited Versailles, and I visited the Cathedral of Notre-Dame. So I have pictures of the front, which looks really nice, and the back, which looks less nice. And I think that this is a very fitting image of society. At least as a Catholic, I feel is also often a fitting image of the Catholic Church. Victor Hugo believed that all monuments need to be preserved. And I think he really would have wanted the restoration to be in the style of the original building. Of course, it's harder with Notre-Dame Cathedral because it was built and rebuilt over centuries in different art styles. He also tends to really hate 19th century art. And he actually thinks that the decline of art began in like the 17th century. That's also, you know, a question to consider. Thank you everybody for watching, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.